Wyoming Territory, December 1872, the wind cut like a blade, and the snow came down hard, blinding and fast across the wide, empty flats of Sweetwater County. Verena Zeller tightened her shawl around her shoulders, but it did nothing against the cold that had already sunk into her bones. Her boots were soaked through, her skirt stiff with frost. She looked down at the little boy in her arms barely 4, cheeks red with windburn, his tiny hands curled into fists against her chest. "Hold on, Waylin," she whispered, voice cracking. "We're going to be all right." "I promise." Her promise tasted like ash in her mouth. She had no idea where they were. The wagon had shattered a wheel 2 days ago, and the driver, some hired hand from Cheyenne, had taken the team and abandoned them, said he was going for help, never came back. Verena had not seen another soul in 36 hours. She had wrapped Waylin in her coat and walked. Westward, she thought, though the wind made it hard to tell. Her feet ached and her lips bled from the cold. The boy had not spoken in hours, just pressed his face into her shoulder and whimpered now and then. She was going to die out here, and worse, Waylin would too. Then, through the thick curtain of snow, she saw movement, a dark shape on horseback. She stopped walking. Could not even lift a hand to wave him down. Her knees buckled and she dropped to the snow, curling her body around the child. The rider came fast. He slid down before his horse had even stopped moving, dropping to his knees beside her. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Can you hear me?" She blinked up at him. He was young, but not too young, mid-20s maybe. A thick coat, worn gloves, a clean-shaven face with sharp features and a worried crease between his brows. He's freezing," she stammered, trying to lift the boy. The cowboy reached forward without hesitation, pulling the child from her arms and tucking him against his chest inside his coat. "He is ice cold," he said. "We have to get both of you warm. My place is close. Can you ride?" She nodded, barely. "I think so." He helped her up gently but quickly. "I'm Fletcher Boone," he said as he hoisted her onto the saddle. "You hold on, I'll walk the horse. We'll be there in 15 minutes. You just hold tight." The name felt like something solid in the storm, Fletcher Boone. She clung to it as much as she clung to the saddle horn. The cabin was tucked into a small grove, smoke rising from a chimney and a barn beside it. The snow had softened the world, made it quiet and white, but warmth poured from the open door when he led her inside. He took the child to the hearth first, unwrapping him and laying him against a pile of blankets near the fire. "He just needs to warm slow," Fletcher said, crouching close. "He is breathing steady." Verena stood by the door, arms limp at her sides, watching her boy's chest rise and fall. She had not realized she was crying until Fletcher stood and gently touched her arm. "We got him just in time," he said. "You too." She looked up into his eyes. They were dark brown, steady. "Thank you," she whispered. "Get those wet things off," he said, stepping back. "Blankets are on the bench, stove's hot. I'll get you both something warm to eat." She nodded and moved slowly, peeling off her soaked skirts and wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. Waylin began to stir, murmuring against the warm wool, and she knelt beside him, brushing his damp hair back. Fletcher came back with stew, thick and hot, and a pot of coffee strong enough to burn through the fog in her chest. They ate in silence, Waylin curled up beside her, clinging to her hand like a lifeline. When the boy finally slept, Fletcher spoke again. "You want to tell me what happened?" She stared into the fire. "I am headed to Salt Lake City. My husband died 4 months ago. We were living in Kansas. I had no family left there. I thought I could start over. I hired a man to drive us, but he left us out there." Fletcher swallowed hard. "You came all that way with just your boy," she nodded. "You got anyone waiting in Salt Lake?" "No one anymore," she said. "I was going to apply for work at the textile mill. Heard they take women with children." Fletcher was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You do not need to decide anything tonight. You are safe here until you figure out what is next." She looked at him. "Why are you out in that storm?" "Cattle," he said simply. "Had 3 calves go missing last night, found them just before I saw you." She stared into the fire again. "Your boy," he said after a moment. "What is his name?" "Waylin." "He is a strong little thing," Fletcher said. "You too." She did not reply, but something in her chest loosened. The warmth of the fire, the quiet of the cabin, Fletcher's calm voice. It was more comfort than she had known in months. That night, she slept on the cot with Waylin curled against her, both wrapped in thick quilts. Fletcher took the floor, left a lantern burning low, and kept the fire going. In the early hours before dawn, Waylin stirred and whispered, "Mama, are we safe here?" She kissed his forehead. "Yes, baby, we are safe." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. When morning came, the storm had passed. Verena stood at the window, watching the sun rise gold over the white hills. Fletcher stepped up behind her, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "You are welcome to stay here a while," he said. "You and the boy, until things feel clearer." She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said softly. He looked at her for a long second, then nodded. "It is no trouble." But it was more than kindness. She saw it in his eyes, a quiet protectiveness, something steady, unspoken. Verena looked down at her son, playing quietly with a carved wooden horse Fletcher had given him. And for the first time since Jacob's death, she let herself hope. Hope that maybe in this cold, wild land, something good was waiting. Something warm, something true. Fletcher's cabin stood firm against the wind that still prowled through the valley, though the worst of the storm had passed. The snow outside had settled into soft drifts, and sunlight spilled across the wooden floor in quiet stripes. Inside, the silence was broken only by the faint clink of tin against enamel as Verena rinsed bowls at the wash basin, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "Didn't think I'd ever see a woman do dishes in this place," Fletcher said from the doorway, his tone light but edged with something thoughtful. Verena glanced over her shoulder, drying her hands on her skirt. "I needed to stand. My legs were stiff." Fletcher stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He brushed snow from his shoulders, then crossed the room to set a small bundle on the table, 2 squirrels, already dressed. "Not much, but it'll do for supper," he said. She nodded. "You hunt often enough." He leaned against the table, arms crossed. "There's more game toward the ridge, but it's a hike. I don't go unless I have to." Waylin sat near the hearth, humming as he pushed an old spool across the floor like a wheel. His cheeks looked healthier today, and his small hands no longer trembled when he reached for things. Verena folded the drying cloth and set it aside. "He asked this morning if you were a sheriff." Fletcher raised a brow. "What you tell him?" "I told him you were a man who found us when we needed someone most. That seemed enough." He nodded once, slowly. "You planning to try for Salt Lake again?" "I don't know yet." She lowered herself onto the bench near the table. "I want to, but I've no way to get there, and I can't risk him getting sick again." Fletcher pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "There's a stage route that runs through Green River, about 20 miles north. Won't run again till spring, though. Roads'll be closed." Her fingers curled against the edge of the table. "Then I suppose we'll be here for a while." He didn't answer right away. The fire cracked behind them, and Waylin's quiet humming carried through the room like a thread holding them all together. "You don't have to feel like you're in the way," Fletcher said at last. "I've lived alone a long time. It's good to hear voices in this place again." She looked at him fully for the first time that day. There was a stillness in him, not indifference, but a kind of quiet knowing. A man who had learned to live with silence and didn't fear it. Her eyes lingered on the way his fingers rested flat against the table, calloused and steady. "You live out here all year?" she asked. "Most years. I drive cattle in the summer, trap in the fall, enough to keep the place fed." "No family nearby?" "Not anymore." Verena didn't press. She reached for Waylin's coat, drying near the fire, and folded it slowly, the scent of smoke clinging to the wool. "You've done more than you needed to," she said. "I know that." Fletcher met her gaze. "I didn't do it out of debt." They sat that way for a moment, neither looking away. Then Waylin stood and patted over, rubbing his eyes. "I'm hungry," he said. Fletcher rose and lifted the bundle of meat from the table. "Let's fix that." The boy followed him to the stove, watching as Fletcher worked, asking questions Verena couldn't quite hear. She leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, letting her eyes rest on the way Fletcher crouched to open the stove door, how he handed Waylin a small pan to carry, how he listened with patience. Later, after supper, Fletcher brought out a deck of worn cards and laid them on the table. "You ever play pitch?" he asked. Verena shook her head. "I don't know that one. I'll teach it." They played by lantern light, Waylin curled asleep beside her, the cards soft-edged and familiar in Fletcher's hands. He didn't talk much, but his voice was even, and he explained the rules without condescension. When she got something wrong, he corrected her gently, and when she won a hand, he gave a quiet nod of approval. When the fire burned low, she gathered Waylin and laid him on the cot again. Fletcher waited by the stove, hands resting on his belt buckle. "I'll be up early," he said. "Got to check the fence line. Snow's heavy enough to bring it down in places." She tucked the quilt around her son, then stood. "Do you want help?" He looked surprised but not displeased. "If you're warm enough and steady on your feet, I won't turn it down." "I'll be ready," she said. Fletcher nodded and moved to the door. Before he stepped outside, he paused. "I'm glad you knocked on my life when you did," he said. "Most folks figure the world's full of trouble. But sometimes it brings the right people together." Then he left, boots crunching across the porch. Verena stood in the silence he left behind, heart steadying itself in the hush of the room. She hadn't knocked, but maybe she would have if she'd known he was there. By mid-January, the snow had settled deep in the gullies, crusted hard on the higher slopes, and the wind had quieted to a low hum across the flats. Verena walked behind Fletcher along the fence line, her boots breaking through the icy top layer with each step. The leather gloves he'd lent her were too large, but they kept her palms from blistering as she held up the posts for him to hammer back in place. "Ground's frozen half a foot down," he said, crouching to brace a warped rail against his knee. "Won't hold right till spring, but it'll keep the cattle from drifting." She nodded and passed him another length of wire. "You think they'll wander far if it breaks again?" "Not likely. They know where their feed is." Verena glanced toward the distant shapes moving near the barn. "How many do you keep?" 22 head right now. Mostly longhorn, a few mixed in from Montana stock." The rhythm of the work steadied her. She hadn't realized how much her body had longed for purpose, something beyond waiting and worrying. Fletcher worked without hurry, sleeves rolled to his elbows, his focus firm and precise. When he paused to stretch his back, she caught the faint line of a scar just beneath his left wrist, pale against the sun-darkened skin. "What happened there?" she asked, nodding toward it. "A mule bucked while I was hitching him. Rope snapped, took a bit of my skin with it." He flexed his fingers. "Wasn't too bad, just ugly." She smiled faintly. "That seems to be how most things out here go." He looked at her a moment, then said, "You don't sound like someone who plans to leave." "I'm not sure I do." They worked until the sun dipped westward, casting long, cold shadows across the snow. By the time they reached the cabin again, Waylin was outside near the porch steps, bundled in Fletcher's old coat, tossing handfuls of snow at the railings. "Missed you," he said as Verena knelt to brush snow from his cheeks. "We missed you too." She kissed his forehead, then turned toward the smell of stew drifting from the open door. "You've been busy, I take it," Fletcher nodded. "He helped me haul wood. Told me a story about a bear that lives in the woods and eats socks." Waylin grinned, teeth white against wind-chapped skin, "Only the left ones." "Well, we'll have to be careful then," Verena said. "I'm short enough pairs as it is." That evening, after Waylin had fallen asleep on a bedroll near the fire, Verena sat on the porch steps wrapped in a blanket. The wind had gone still, the stars sharp and bright above the treetops. Fletcher came out with 2 mugs of heated cider and handed her one without a word. She took it, cradling the warmth. "You ever think about leaving this place?" He sat beside her, boots scraping softly against the wood. "Used to, thought about Denver once, maybe cattle up in Oregon. But I got tired of chasing things, decided to build something instead." She looked over at him, the firelight from inside brushing his jaw. "You built all this alone. Took 4 years. The barn came first, slept in it the first winter, cabin was second. Why here?" He sipped his cider. "Because it's quiet, because the land doesn't lie to you. If something breaks, you fix it. If you put in the work, you get to eat. Nothing's hidden." Verena was quiet a long time. Then she said, "I used to think cities were safer. More people, more rules. But they're just as cold when you're alone." He didn't reply, just set his mug down and folded his hands. She turned toward him. "You've done more than give us shelter, Fletcher. You've given him safety. I see it in how he sleeps now." He looked at her then. "And you?" "I'm still learning what safety feels like." He reached over slowly, not touching her, but close enough she could feel the warmth of his hand near hers. "You don't have to decide anything fast, but if you stay, this place could be yours too, not by obligation, just if you want it." Verena looked down at their hands, then back at the fields beyond the barn, silent, white, waiting. "I don't know what comes next," she said softly, "but I'd like to keep waking up here, for now." "That's enough," he said, and for the first time she believed it might be. By late January, the days had grown longer, though the sun still clung low in the sky. The snow held, but in places where the wind had swept it clean, the dry earth peeked through a reminder that the world beneath was only sleeping, not gone. Verena stood beside the root cellar, her hands dusted with flour as she folded back the lid. Fletcher had mentioned he kept onions and dried apples down there, and she'd offered to sort what was left. Her breath curled in the air as she climbed into the dim, earthy space, reaching for the wooden crate pushed farthest back. Above, Fletcher's boots sounded in the packed snow. "You find the apples," he called down. "Nearly," she answered, lifting the lid from the crate. "They're buried under some beans." There was a pause, then the creak of the ladder settling under his weight. He ducked down into the low space, brushing against the ceiling as he moved to her side. "Should have warned you it's cramped," he said. "Built it before I realized I'd grow into my back." Verena smiled faintly and held up the rough bundle of apples wrapped in muslin. "They're still good, dry but sweet," he nodded, brushing a bit of dust from her sleeve. "You do more in a day than I can keep up with." "You always move like the work's chasing you." Her smile faded, and she looked toward the small window cut into the stone. "I've never known what happens when I stop moving." "Maybe nothing," he said. "Or maybe something better." She turned to face him fully, the cool air close between them. "Did you always mean to live this far from town?" Fletcher leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "I thought I'd stay close to people when I first came west. Started out near Rawlins, but the noise got under my skin. Too many voices telling me who I ought to be." "And who did you want to be?" He hesitated. "Just a man who keeps his word, and keeps his hands busy." She studied him, the way his eyes didn't shift when he spoke, how he never rushed to fill silence. "You've done both." He nodded once, then reached for the apples and handed her the bundle. "Come on, you'll freeze down here." They stepped back into the light, snow crunching beneath their boots. Inside, Waylin sat cross-legged by the hearth, carving a notch into a stick with Fletcher's pocket knife. He glanced up as they entered. "Do you find the good ones?" he asked. Verena held up the muslin wrap. "Enough to make a pie if we stretch the flour." Fletcher hung his coat near the stove. "If you make a pie, I'll split wood till spring." That evening, the scent of cinnamon filled the cabin. Verena stood at the table, rolling out the dough with the back of a tin cup. Fletcher had fixed the draft beneath the door that morning, and the warmth inside no longer slipped away as quickly as it used to. After supper, they sat near the fire, Waylin asleep again before his second slice was done. Fletcher leaned back in the chair, one boot propped on the hearthstone. "You ever think of marrying again?" she asked, not looking at him. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might let the question pass. "I did once," he said finally. "Back when I first came out here, there was a girl in Saratoga. Her father ran sheep, we talked some. But I wasn't much more than a hand with a saddle roll, and she wanted someone with land." Verena traced the rim of her mug. "She was foolish, no, just honest." She turned toward him. "And now," he looked at her then, not hurried, just steady. "Now I'd rather build something with someone who's already walked through fire. Someone who knows what it means to start again." The words settled between them, heavy and warm. Verena reached for the quilt draped over the bench and laid it gently across Waylin. "He's begun calling this place home." Fletcher nodded. "It could be, if you want it." She sat beside him. "I'm not afraid of starting again, not if it's here." He didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but his voice was low and sure. "Then we'll build it together. You, me, and that boy." Outside, the snow fell soft and slow, like it had all the time in the world. Inside, the fire burned low, steady in its warmth. And for the first time, Verena felt the weight in her chest ease, not because she was resting, but because she'd found where to begin. The thaw came slow that February, but it came. Ice along the eaves wept into steady drips by midday, and the path to the barn stayed slushy well past noon. Fletcher had pulled the sleigh from storage, scraped off the rust, and repaired the runners so he could haul feed to the far pasture once the melt cleared enough to pass. Verena stood in the doorway, watching Waylin trace a crooked line in the mud with a stick. Fletcher had given the boy tasks, small ones, fitting for his age but meaningful. Fill the lanterns, sweep the porch, check the henhouse. She'd noticed Waylin's shoulders squaring a little more each day, like he was beginning to understand his place here wasn't borrowed, but earned. Behind her, the cabin smelled of fresh lye soap and drying linen. She'd scrubbed the floorboards after breakfast, a quiet offering to a home that had taken them in without question. Fletcher stepped up behind her, wiping his hands with a rag. Thought I'd ride north tomorrow, check the far ridge. Creek's likely running high might have shifted the fence again, she nodded. How long will you be gone? 2 nights, 3 if the snow's deeper up there than it looks. I'll keep the fire tended, she said, glancing at him. We'll be fine. He studied her face, then nodded once. I know, she let her eyes rest on him. You trust easy, I don't, he said, but I trust you. His words settled between them, not heavy but sure. She reached for his hand and he let her take it. That evening, after Waylin had gone to bed with his usual 3 questions, will the horses sleep too? Do the stars ever blink? Can we keep the pie from yesterday for breakfast? Verena sat by the fire with a piece of mending in her lap. Fletcher was carving a new latch for the barn door from a length of pine, his knife movements slow and deliberate. You ever miss being around more people? She asked. He didn't look up. Used to think I would. But I've got what I need here now. She folded the shirt she'd finished patching and set it aside. What changed? His eyes lifted to hers. You showed up. She didn't answer right away. The fire hissed as a log settled deeper into the coals. I didn't come looking for anything, she said quietly. Not even safety, just a place where I wouldn't have to keep running. You still feel like running, she shook her head. Not anymore. He set the carving aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Verena, I'm not a man who says things just to fill the air. But there's not a day since you stepped into this house I haven't thought about what it'd be like if you stayed for good. Not for the winter, not to wait out the roads. But because you wanted to. She reached over, took his hand in both of hers, her grip steady. I do. He let out a breath, quiet but full, like he'd been holding it for longer than he realized. Then marry me. It wasn't a question, it wasn't hurried. It was solid, like every other thing he'd built with his hands. Yes, she said. A smile crept into his expression, soft and certain. We'll keep it simple. Preacher comes through the valley every March. We'll ask him to stop. I don't need more than that, she whispered. He pressed her hand to his chest, then leaned forward, and when he kissed her, it was slow and warm, like the thaw itself, something the cold couldn't hold back forever. They married under a pale sky streaked with the last threads of snow, Waylin holding a bundle of dried sage while the preacher spoke. Fletcher wore his cleanest shirt and boots polished with beeswax. Verena had taken lace from a handkerchief and sewn it to the collar of her best dress. Waylin stood between them, his hand in hers, Fletcher's resting on his shoulder. Afterward, they ate from tin plates around the fire, laughter echoing off the cabin walls, and when the preacher rode off the next morning, Verena watched from the porch, her hand tucked into Fletcher's. Spring crept in slow. The creek swelled and dropped. Birds returned to the pines. Verena planted herbs outside the kitchen window. Fletcher built a small pen for 2 goats he'd traded for in town. Waylin grew sturdy, his cheeks full, his stride confident. He took to following Fletcher to the barn each morning, asking questions about bridles and hooves and the best way to stack hay. One evening, after the day's work was done, Verena sat on the porch step, rocking with a quiet rhythm. Fletcher came behind her, slid his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. He's calling me Pa now, he said, I heard. You all right with that? She leaned against him. I want him to have a name for the man who shows up for him every day. You've earned it. Fletcher pressed a kiss to her temple. I meant what I said. Everything I have is yours. She turned to face him fully. And I mean this, there's no life I want that doesn't start and end right here. They kissed with the kind of ease that only came from knowing the worst had already passed, and that what lay ahead could be faced together. That night, with the windows open and the scent of wet earth drifting in, Verena lay beside him, her hand resting over his heart, steady as the land beneath them. They spoke little, but the silence was full. What they had now wasn't borrowed, it wasn't survival. It was home built day by day, word by word, hand in hand, and it would hold. always.